Okay. And Shal, I'll give you the floor to start with the introductions.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to the Canadian Sleep Research Consortium Sleep Education webinar series. Today's topic is about sleep, insomnia, and emotional regulations. My name is Charles Morin from Laval University in Quebec City. And I'm very pleased to have the honor to moderate this session and introduce our speaker. And before I do that, I just want to let you know that the webinar, as others have in the past, is recorded and will be made available on the Sleep Consortium website and the YouTube channel after the talk is over today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Chiara Baglioni. Chiara is a professor in clinical and health psychology at the Department of Human Sciences at the University of Guglielmo Marconi of Rome in Italy. She's been there since 2015. Her main research interest focuses on sleep and mental health, sleep psychology, insomnia, and its treatment. She is currently coordinating the European Insomnia Network of the European Sleep Research Society. Dr. Baglioni obtained her master's degree in psychology in 2004 and completed her PhD in clinical psychophysiology at the Department of Psychology of the Sapienza University in Rome. In 2009, she was awarded the prestigious European Commission Marie Curie postdoc research grant and moved to the sleep laboratory of the University of Freiburg in Germany, where she remained for 11 years, supported by several grants from the German research institutions. In 2021, she received the Italian National Habilitation as full professor, and her current research activity is supported by two grants of the Italian Ministry of University and Research. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Chiara, and she will be talking about sleep, insomnia, and emotional regulation. Chiara.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this kind introduction and for also for the kind invitation. I'm very pleased and honored to be to join the Canadian Sleep Consortium webinar series. So I will just upload my slides. So this works, right? You can see my slides.
Yes, we do.
So thanks also to all people who are joining to this talk. So the topic of my talk, as Charles said, is the relationship between sleep, insomnia, and emotions. And when I when I was working on the slides, I realized that I couldn't be comprehensive and extensive in talking about this topic. So I choose to divide the presentation in four parts, which consider four arguments which I think are important to consider when studying the relationship between emotional regulation and sleep and insomnia. Well, so I reported only some examples, which right now I realize I didn't include an extensive actually work, a recent systematic review and meta-analysis about emotional regulation and insomnia, which, however, I would suggest afterwards to consider if you are interested in the topic. So I would like to start by the importance of sleep and insomnia for mental health by giving just a brief introduction, and then shifting to emotional regulation, as emotional regulation might have an important role in explaining why sleep and mental health are so strictly associated. And I think before reporting some example of empirical evidence about sleep, insomnia, and emotional regulation, it is nice and interesting to have consideration of the theoretical frameworks and research methods which underline psychological research, psychophysiological research on emotions and emotional processes. Then afterwards, I will report some few examples of empirical studies considering emotional processes and especially emotional regulation in sleep and insomnia, which I repeat is not comprehensive, there's much more. And if you are interested in the topic, you can find so many more papers and studies as the ones I will quote in this presentation. And I would like to finish with a very short look on clinical implications. So I will just start from the first point. The point that sleep is important for health and especially for mental health, it is actually something we always knew. We have evidence from early Egypt or from ancient Egypt that sleep was using as a healing method, especially for some complex illness for which people didn't know the original cause, so especially for mental disorders. And we have, sorry, and we have also knowledge from ancient Greece medicine, which used to recognize an association between melancholia and sleep continuity problem as problems in falling asleep or maintaining sleep. And they already treated the sleep problems with alcohol, listening to music, or reading. Then in more recent times, with the first classification of mental disorder from Emil Kraepelin, sleep was also an important aspect to be considered, and it was especially associated with depression. And the idea of Emil Kraepelin was that different sleep problems could be associated with different types of depression. So we have a more neurotic psychological depression, which could be more associated to problems to fall asleep, and a more endogenous biological caused depression, which was more associated with early morning awakenings and problems to maintain sleep. So though it was already known that sleep was very important for mental health and especially depression, still not much studies have been conducted in the psychiatric field considering sleep. This is because sleep has been conceptualized for a long period as a passive state. So the idea was more or less that our brain needed to turn off to have a break from the stimuli and activity of the day, and that was it. And if you consider artworks until the beginning of last century, you can see many paintings in which sleep is represented as death, or in the mythologies, often the gods of sleep are the brothers or relatives of the gods of death. It was only in the middle of the last century, with the discovery of the EEG, and especially for sleep, of the REM sleep, that we started to know that sleep is not a passive process, but is a very active process and is fundamental for brain function. Still, we still haven't got many answers about the question why we sleep. First answer came from animal research, showing the necessity to sleep for physiological processes, as for example thermoregulation. And just in the last decades, more studies on humans recognize the importance of sleep for psychological processes as memory organization and consolidation, problem solving, creativity, and also emotional processes. So considering the history of sleep in psychiatric research, a first promising area of research was started actually in the 1960s in the Pittsburgh Sleep Laboratory by David Kapfer and Charles Reynolds, in which the authors actually compared the polysomnographic recordings of good sleepers and healthy sleepers and patients with depression. And they were very impressed and excited to find that these profiles were very different because patients with depression presented several alterations of sleep, especially considering REM sleep. So they had a shortened REM sleep onset latency, increased REM sleep density, and an increased duration of REM sleep. So these promising results were actually a bit stopped by a very important historical work, which was guided by Ruth Benka and co-authors in 1992, in which the authors offered and published a first meta-analytic work by putting together all the studies which were conducted so far on mental disorders and sleep recordings in patients with mental disorders. And as you can see from the results, in mood disorders, and especially this category was especially defined by depression, was associated with the most impaired profile of sleep. With altered sleep variables. All variables were altered in patients with depression compared to good sleepers, but there was no single variable which was impaired only in mood disorders compared to the other mental disorders, which led a bit to the destruction of the idea that sleep research in psychiatric field could be used to recognize biological markers of specific mental disorders. And actually, this work actually corresponded in a break, in a stopping to evaluate sleep in the psychiatric field until couple of decades ago, in which sleep was reinterpreted, for example, from also other authors, not anymore as a field which could help to recognize early biological markers of mental disorders, but as a field which can recognize a transdiagnostic fundamental process for mental health. We have been replicating in 2016 in the laboratory of Freiburg the meta-analysis of Ruth Benka by considering all studies from 1992 to 2016. And we divided the sleep variables in three main groups. The sleep continuity group was considered sleep onset, latency, number of awakening, and wake after sleep onset. The sleep that was considering all the non-REM sleep stages, and REM pressure considered a group of REM variables. And as you can see from the graphs, especially sleep continuity was systematically impaired and diminished in all mental disorder considered, with only exception for seasonal affective disorders and ADHD, although you have to know that these two groups were pretty little compared to the other groups. And while sleep depth and REM pressure were also often impaired in many mental disorders, there was a less systematic pathway observed compared to sleep continuity. And we know that impairment in sleep continuity is an essential feature of insomnia disorder. And these results were consistent with other important results, which actually associate insomnia as a risk factor for mental health, especially depression, because this is the disorder for which we have more evidence and more data, but also for psychopathology in general, as the study which were guided by Elisabeth Hertenstein in 2019 and then replicated in 2023. So considering the theories, the transdiagnostic theory of sleep discontinuity and mental disorders, especially this one proposed by Ellis and Harvey and co-authors, a main pathway which might explain why sleep, especially sleep continuity, that is problems associated with insomnia, might be associated with increased vulnerability of mental for psychopathology, is the strict association between sleep processes and emotional processes. And that is the idea is if we understand better how sleep, insomnia, and emotional processes interact between each other, then we can also understand better how the link between sleep continuity problems and the onset of mental disorder works. And then maybe we can have also important implication for clinical practice. So, going to the second part of this presentation, what is emotional regulation, how we define it and how we study it. I think first of all, we need to start by defining what is an emotion. So emotions are brief responses to internal or external stimulation characterized by a balance, positive or negative, and a specific strength, which is called also, we call it also arousal, and which is expressed at a physiological level, which is also called emotional reactivity, or to a subjective level or to a behavioral level. So to understand the physiological emotional reactivity is expressed by the physiological response that we can measure, for example, by measuring the movement of the face muscles with electromyography. And what we measure is the intensity of the physiological response and the duration of the physiological response, which are two different variables which define how the physiological response has reacted to the emotional stimulus. When we consider the subjective experience, then we consider whether the subjective perception, if I'm happy, if I'm sad, if I'm angry, and the behavioral level can be expressed, for example, by laughing or crying or other. And what is then emotion regulation? The emotion regulation reflects the individual differences in the ability to regulate the emotional response for adjusting to the environmental demands or for personal goals. So when an emotional stimulus is presented, individuals deploy their attention toward it, and an emotional response is generated. So this is actually reflects a very known and classical models of emotional regulation, which is called the process model of emotional regulation, proposed by Gross in 1998, which actually starts by defining how an emotion is generated. So there is a situation, we pay attention to this situation because this activating stimulus is relevant for us. So an emotion is stimulated by relevant events. And then we interpret this event. That's why it's also called the process model of emotion regulation, is also called the cognitive model of emotion regulation. And this interpretation guide an emotional response. So by knowing this process in the emotion generation process, then we can also understand the model of emotion regulation. The idea is that we can regulate our emotional reaction to the stimulus actually in each phase of the emotion generation process. And we can, for example, change a situation. If I know that I might be too shy in a party, I can decide to don't go to the party. That would be a way of changing the situation. Or I can change the deployment of my attention, or I can change the interpretation of the situation, or I can change the response. So the idea of this model is that the later the emotional strategies are activated, especially the emotion regulation strategy activated when the response is already generated, might be less healthy, especially when applied systematically and independently from the context, by considering those emotion regulation strategies which are activated before the response is generated. Then future research, actually more modern research, actually revised this idea, because we know there are some emotional regulation strategies which can be applied after the emotional response is generated, which actually are considered positive emotional regulation strategy. For example, acceptance of negative emotion is a very diffuse, actually, argument also in clinical practice. There is an interesting model proposed by Coppens and colleagues in 2010, which is actually not only a model of emotional regulation, but it's more a model of general affective process. Mainly, the model defined 3 dimensions in which individuals differ in their emotional experience. First of all, we differ in our home-based affect. Some of us report as a trait aspect more positive emotion, and some of us less. Then we change in the variability in the way our affective states change in response to relevant stimuli, and this is called affect variability. Third, we different in the duration and easiness of returning to baseline levels, so the attractor strength. Now, these 2 models are not in contradiction with each other, but again, actually been seen together, because the easiness and duration that we require to come back to baseline levels is actually associated to which emotional regulation strategies and processes we apply. So we can put together the 2 models when we studied the emotional regulation processes. And I chose these 2 models. Again, this is not extensive to explain all emotional regulation frameworks which have been proposed, but I think these 2 models are those 2 mostly used for evidence-based research on sleep, insomnia, and emotional regulatory processes. Then just a quick slide on how emotional regulation is studied, so research methods. Well, when we want to study the subjective experience of emotional regulation, then we use questionnaires. So there are different questionnaires. The positive and negative affective states is actually more associated to the balance of emotion. And then we have specific questionnaires about emotional regulatory processes as the DARES or the ERQ. Then we can study the psychophysiological studies, mainly in laboratory studies, differences in emotional regulatory processes. This is often done by considering difference in emotional reactivity between groups, and then interpreting those as also, like, for example, altered emotional reactivity process as an indirect indicator of altered emotional regulatory process. Or there are some studies in which people are instructed to use an emotional regulatory strategy and another, and then psychophysiological measures are used to understand which differences in emotional reactivity exist between the use of one emotional regulatory strategies or the another. And then there is a new approach, which is using ecological momentary studies to assess sleep, insomnia, and emotional processes. So after this brief introduction, then I want to report just a few examples of what has been done in research associated with sleep and insomnia to consider the role of emotion regulation. First of all, we've been speaking about the importance of how sleep processes and emotional processes are interrelated between each other, and might explain the link between poor sleep and a measured vulnerability for mental disorders. What about insomnia disorder? What is the role of emotional regulation in explaining the insomnia disorder? If we consider in the classical 3P models for insomnia, which consider an interaction which considered that a disorder of insomnia is explained by interaction between predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors, then emotional regulation difficulties have been reported to probably been both a vulnerability factor for insomnia disorder and a maintaining factor for insomnia disorder. So first group of studies actually had been considering that patients with insomnia disorder compared to healthy good sleepers present a trait tendency to use more disadaptive emotion regulation strategies, as for example, the strategies of emotional suppression. So what is the strategy of emotional suppression? This is a strategy which we apply after the emotional response is already generated, and we try to suppress the behavioral component of the emotional expression. So, for example, if I feel very angry with a friend, but I don't want to show it because I think this friend might be too offended and might be not my friend anymore, then I will not show it. I will still feel the anger. I will still feel the physiological tension and arousal, but I won't show my anger. And the idea is that this can be a maladaptive emotional regulation strategy, especially when we use it systematically and not dependent on the context. On the same time, the other idea is that the experience of insomnia disorder elicit an increase in alteration of emotion dysregulation, which act also as a maintaining factor. That is, insomnia is associated with a strong emotional experience. So we know the diagnosis of insomnia, the definition of insomnia is strictly associated with daytime symptoms. So experiencing insomnia has a strong impact on quality of life, implying personal and social difficulties in daytime functioning. Patient perspective often includes limits to work success, limits for being the desired self, a silent hidden problem, hopeless, and lack of trust on insomnia treatment, which is often associated with delay in diagnosis and treatment. That is often etiological model of insomnia have recognized an increased hyperarousal defined by physiological hyperarousal and cognitive hyperarousal, but these two are associated with an increased experience of negative emotion, which is also an increased emotional hyperarousal, which has been less investigated. So now I would just report some examples of empirical studies focusing on emotional processes. So two first studies focus on evaluating the differences in face muscles activity between people with insomnia and good sleepers exposed to the presentation of validated positive, negative, and neutral stimuli, generally related with experience of insomnia or good sleep. I like to present these two studies because we could replicate the same finding, which was that people with insomnia presented a decreased activity in the corrugator muscle compared to good sleepers in response to sleep-related positive pictures, which we interpret that it could be associated with a craving response of people with insomnia for a situation which is desired. We conducted a similar study by using an fMRI paradigm. Participants, patients with insomnia and healthy good sleepers were studied in an fMRI study while they were shown emotional stimuli, negative or neutral, balanced, already validated, and with different levels of arousal. So there were three groups with moderate levels of arousal and one group with high level of arousal, 2 groups of generally negative pictures, 1 group with neutral content, and 1 group insomnia related. We could find that people with insomnia showed an increased amygdala reactivity when watching the insomnia related pictures. And they also presented an interesting pathway in considering the neutral moderate arousal and negative moderate arousal pictures, while good sleepers showed a response to the balance of the pictures, so people with insomnia did not. Finally, another studies in which we evaluated physiological response, which is actually at the moment under review to emotional stimuli, was conducted in the Freiburg Sleep Lab and compared 97 patients with insomnia and 96 healthy controls. So the patients with insomnia were further randomized in a group that on the 5 days before could sleep as usual, and a group that in the 5 days before could sleep only was partially sleep deprived. They had the instruction that they couldn't sleep for more than 5 hours per night. And then they participated to a lab study. We used, instead of pictures, dynamical stimuli, which were brief videos, validated videos to be negative associated or associated with the experience of insomnia. And also here we found different results, especially we measured all the components of the emotional response. So we had questionnaire for the subjective component. With video recorder, they face to evaluate through the phase system, the behavioral response to the stimuli. And then we use facial electromyography to measure the activity of the zygomatic muscle, which activates when we laugh, and the corrugator muscle, which activates when we corrugate, so generally when we experience negative emotions. What we could find was independently on the group, the negative films were associated with increased actually, the insomnia films were associated with an increased zygomatic activity compared to the sadness-related films. And actually, what we find in the electromyography results is that people with insomnia should measure activity of the zygomatic muscle compared to healthy controls, which we consider maybe as an indication of kind of like experience laughing, like I know this situation, I already experienced this situation. However, in the behavioral analysis, people with insomnia showed more anger for the insomnia-related pictures compared to the sadness-related pictures, and we found differences in questionnaires. So what about emotional regulation? So now I have to apologize. I took these single studies as example, and I didn't include the results of a recent meta-analysis, which we've been published about emotion dysregulation and insomnia, which I would suggest maybe I can put it in the chat, the reference afterwards. So there are several studies which use questionnaires of emotion regulation, and they found differences in patients with insomnia and in healthy controls by pointing out that patients with insomnia might present a trait differences, a trait alteration, and a measured use of these adaptive emotional regulatory strategies compared to healthy controls. There is an interesting study on adolescent sleep and mental health, which through interesting analysis, they actually showed through a questionnaire study that, but in a very large sample, considering more than 10,000 adolescents ranging from 13 to 18 years, the association between sleep problems and anxiety and mood disorder was associated by the use of different emotion regulatory strategies, especially suppression, but also an increased use of rumination and tentative of problem solving. And this was also similar results were found in a group of adults of 740 individuals by considering the association between sleep and stress and aggression and the mediating role of emotion regulatory strategies. A last group of studies which I think are interesting are those studies which try to evaluate the association of the variables in natural life context, which they apply ecological momentary assessment design to avoid the possible bias in the emotional responses which the lab can induce. We have conducted a recent study on ecological momentary assessment focusing on sleep continuity, insomnia, and emotion regulation. This is the same sample of the EMG study which I showed before, but this is the data on the 5 previous days in which we followed the individuals during the day. They had a smartphone in which they had to fill in every day and every night the sleep diaries and emotional diaries. And then for 4 random times per day, they had to report their emotional experience. And main results showed that patients with insomnia compared to good sleepers, the good sleepers were also were the same study, so they were half in a sleep restriction and half co-sleep as usual. And patients with insomnia reported poorer sleep, increased negative emotion, decreased positive emotion, and increased use of maladaptive emotion regulatory strategies, and a decreased use of adaptive emotion regulatory strategies. Independently from the group, higher sleep alterations during the night were associated with the day after increased negative emotion. And interesting, only in patients with insomnia, we found that use during the day of adaptive emotion regulatory strategies were associated with better sleep on the next night, which might have interesting clinical application. So, by putting together all these results, we can say that so far, study empirical results on insomnia have been showing that insomnia disorder is associated with an increased report of negative emotion and a decreased experience of positive emotion, an increased altered emotional physiological reactivity, especially associated to insomnia related experience, which is in some way is the evidence-based result of what patients also report. I go to bed and the only vision on my bed just put me in a bad mood because I know the night will be a disaster. And the evidence on emotional regulation strategies show that patients with insomnia present alteration on emotional regulatory tend to use more those emotional regulatory strategies which have been considered to be maladaptive because they are associated with a longer duration of the emotional experience and emotional activity and a stronger intensity. So just a very quick just a very quick point on the REM sleep instability hypothesis. This is an hypothesis which is associated to data which were analyzed by Bernd Feige, which showed that patients with insomnia compared to good sleeper present especially an instability and more interaction in the REM sleep periods, as REM sleep periods have been associated with the emotional experience because limbic areas are associated with the REM sleep. This is supposed to be an important physiological underneath process explain why emotional processes might be altered in patients with insomnia. What about specific population? I think one point we have, so I just wanted to conclude with that, is that one point we have is that most data come from adults, mixed women and men, and we have little knowledge on specific population. There is especially one population which is receiving major attention right now, which is women during pregnancy. This is because it's pretty surprising that so far we do not have many data on sleep, emotion, and pregnancy, as this is such a sensible period and so important not only for the woman mental health, but also for the child health and mental health. So as you saw before, there is a meta-analysis which have been shown that poor sleep during pregnancy is a predictor of perinatal depression, both at the end of the pregnancy and after the birth of the child. What we wanted to do in this systematic review, which we are finishing right now, is to study how emotion variables were studied, also cognitive variables were studied in relation to sleep during a pregnancy. We could collect data from 23 studies. And the first question was, is poor sleep health or insomnia symptoms associated with alteration in cognitive and emotional processes during pregnancy? Does poor sleep health correlate with cognitive and emotional processing in pregnant women? So what we have was a first question on correlational study and a second question on longitudinal study by comparing women with poor sleep with women with good sleep in different designs. So the main result is actually we didn't find much, but studies which are available, they actually show positive results for unaltered emotional and cognitive functioning in women during pregnancy who report poor sleep, especially I think the variables which have been most studied is nocturnal rumination and worry, especially worry associated with sleep. So why is it important to put together all emotional processes, behavioral processes, and cognitive processes in considering sleep health and insomnia? We have recently considered that sleep and emotional define are associated with which our sleep is actually regulated not only from physiological drives, but also from behavioral drives. So I try to explain myself a bit better. We need to fall asleep. We need a period of the evening in which we wind down. This behavior is not only reported by humans, but also many animals show this period of the wake, which is not anymore an active wake period, but is a quiet period which prepares to sleep. For example, we know that mice, before going to sleep, they prepare their nest. So they activate in a repetitive, standardized behavioral routines, which prepare for falling asleep. And we do the same actually by reading or dedicating ourselves to pleasing activity. And we wind down, and this is the pathway which brings us to good sleep. And this pathway is actually dependent by a strict interaction between emotion regulatory strategies, which manage to to create a distance between the active wave and the quiet evening, to wind down and then to fall asleep. So that is the idea that the emotion regulatory strategies are important to be targeted in sleep research, because they might help to understanding better this winding down and pre-sleep routines period. Which brings me to the last part of the talk about the few clinical implications. So what we do with all these studies about the clinical implication, there are two models which have been proposed. The first idea is that it comes from the first study, the meta-analytic study, by showing that insomnia is a predictor for depression or mental disorders. The consequence was that maybe if we treat patient with depression or psychopathology in general, also with the standard treatment for insomnia, then we can obtain results also for the other disorder. There are several clinical studies which show that when treating insomnia in patients with depression, this is actually effective not only for the insomnia symptoms, but also for the depression symptoms. There are relatively less studies, although promising, which investigate whether effective treatment of insomnia might reduce the risk to develop depression or other mental disorders. But there are a few studies showing that. One was conducted by Elizabeth Hertenstein, and was actually a systematic review, which was pretty interesting. The other model in the clinical application is the idea that both the the CBT for insomnia and the standard therapy for emotion regulation could be used as transdiagnostic protocols to be used in clinical practice for mental disorders in general. And just last mentioning to the possibility to use virtual reality in insomnia treatment to consider emotional aspect of pre-sleep behaviors and pre-sleep window, and not only for relaxation techniques, but also for exposition techniques, which are also associated with the work on the emotional experience. I think my time is over, so I would like to come to the end of the talk. I'm very happy to just discuss and deepen some of these parts in the question part. So I will just go to the end, and thanks very much everyone for the attention, and especially Charles for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for this wonderful talk and a great overview of this particular area of research on sleep, insomnia, and emotional regulation. So I would invite all the participants on the webinar to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to write your questions. And as you're doing this, I might start with a couple questions for you, Chiara. And one is about the link you make between, or we could make, I guess, between emotional regulation strategies and coping skills. I know that some research has shown that it's not so much the amount of stress that a person is exposed to that is likely to trigger sleep disturbances, but it's much more how they react or their coping skills to react with those stressful situations. Is that different when we talk about coping skill than what you're talking about in emotional regulation?
Yeah, they're very connected concept and constructs, but I do think they're a bit different. So when we speak about coping, we are really looking at reaction to stressors, so how we handle the stress. And when we, I think emotional regulation is more a broader term and is specifically associated to the down regulation or also the up regulation of the emotional response. So at first, it could also go in the other way. So I just like, if I'm not specifically associated with a stressor or a negative situation, and specifically based on the regulation of emotion, while coping is more the way I try to handle a stressor. So it could be also cognitive problem-solving organization or something. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's good to keep them. Of course, they're very interrelated. So at the end, it's more a theoretical distinction, but I think it's good to keep them separated.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question and then I'll go to the audience. Maybe I'd like to hear you a little bit more about the implication of your talk for treatment. You say then we can continue using CBTI, but adding some emotional regulation strategies. What are you thinking of specifically? Are we talking about mindfulness, about third wave cognitive therapies, about acceptance and commitment therapies? Are you talking about other therapeutic strategies?
Yeah, maybe, but of course, there is all this new clinical research on adding protocols directed to emotion regulation to the standard CBTI protocol. So, as you said, mindfulness for insomnia or ACT therapy for insomnia, which I think is suited for the advanced level of CBTI, so that would be a full psychological intervention. And I think it's really interesting. It might be more, especially for some patient, it could be a way to target the daytime symptoms better. Like we know that the CBTI standard protocols are more, especially the behavioral sleep interventions are more directed to the sleep nighttime symptoms. So this emotional regulation protocols might be actually effective to be applied in some patients with insomnia. The other way of doing it is to consider more the last slide. I went a bit quick because I thought I was taking too much time, but it could be also interesting to use the new methodology. Like, for example, virtual reality could be a good way of studying the emotional experience of insomnia in another period and not in the middle of the night. So I could expose the individuals to their bedroom in the middle of the night, and then ask them how they feel, and consider a bit in a more specific way, both in a research context, in a clinical context, the emotional experience of the night awakening and the experience, I don't know what to do if I don't fall asleep again. So yeah, I think it is actually interesting. The other thing is interesting is to go a step away from insomnia and use CBTI more as a transdiagnostic protocol for sleep health in mental disorders.
Thank you. So we have several questions here, and some of them are a little bit outside the scope of your specific topic. So maybe I'll still ask you and you see how you want to handle that. But one is about, well, I think it was just deleted from the chat. But there's one here. May I know if it is a must to check PANAS if someone wishes to explore the emotional issues and sleep? PANAS, Is that the acronym for one of the instruments you mentioned, or I'm not entirely sure about what this is referring to? Would you know, Chiara?
If someone wished
The last one.
I don't know if I understood the question correctly, but the PANAS is a good instrument to measure the base, what in the model of Koppenzela is called the base effect. So the normal, the trait, our general experience of positive and negative effects. So how we generally, it is an instrument which includes a list of negative and positive effects, 10 positive and 10 negatives, and you have to indicate for each effect how much you feel it, how much you experience, generally as a trait measure, or you can use it, for example, in ecological momentary assessment, like in this moment, how much do you feel amused or interested or something. So this is more a measure of the emotional experience and less of the emotional regulation aspects.
Okay.
I'm not sure answer to the question.
Well, maybe that person asking the question can follow up with an additional question if needed. But we have one here. Well, maybe you can read it as well. Since about 90% of serotonin and much of the body's melatonin are made in the gut, and because serotonin is needed to make melatonin, it makes me wonder how much do we focus on treating gut problems when dealing with sleep disorders?
I don't know.
Well,
in
I suppose that we would need some data on the microbiota.
I think maybe I'm also a bit like reading all the story more from a psychological framework, because we know that yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
that
A more general question, Chiara. So what is most needed in terms of research to move the field forward? Based on what you have accomplished so far in this particular area, we have a lot of trainees on the webinar today. So what's needed for future research to move the field forward?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think what we need is more longitudinal studies, which are always very hard to be done. And so on one side, I think these are very important, but on the other side, I know that it's not easy to be done. But for example, it's always a bit a question, like what comes first? Is that people who are people who have which present a trait difficulties in emotion regulation, which are more exposed to sleep difficulties, or is the other way around? Probably both are true. The directions by as it's interesting to understand more on that. Like, for example, the link between insomnia and depression, I think is very interesting, because we do know that both directions can influence each other. But we also know that it's much more frequent that first you develop insomnia and afterwards depression. And I think this is also clinically important, because it draws more attention to treat early insomnia. So it would be also good to have more studies, longitudinal study on the field of emotions and sleep and insomnia. And the other thing, I think it would be interesting to understand more on gender and age differences in this.
Thank you. Thank you. So a follow-up question to a previous one. I meant, can't we assess only one component, either happiness or sadness? So is it better to check both end of the continuum, sad and happy components?
Here it's meant to be considered only one component. Happiness.
The very last one.
Well, it depends on how you measure. I think this is a very different on the measure. Like, for example, if you have the panels, this is not only one component. The panels recognize two distinct dimensions, the positive effect and the negative effect. They're not in the same dimension. There are two different dimensions. So if you have another model in which the more positive, the less negative, then this is another way. But I think generally the instruments to measure emotion do separate the dimension of positivity and the dimension of negativity, even because you can both be high in both. You can also experience at the same time high positive and high negative emotions. I think the most instruments, they do not define a single dimension for sad and happy. Yeah.
Thank you, Chiara. We have very positive comments, and we would have some more questions, but I think that our time is up. And I want to thank you for taking the time to give this presentation today. It's been, I'm sure, very enriching for everyone. And I want to remind everyone that the recording will be available on the Canadian Sleep Research Consortium website shortly. So thank you all for your participation, and we invite you to join us again next month for another webinar from the Sleep Consortium series. Thank you so much, Chiara.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you for organizing everything. Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening and nice afternoon. Bye.